So let me please welcome you to this very important webinar on the role, the past, the present and the future, the women's role and advocacy in the Korean peace. My name is Madeleine Rees and I am the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm delighted to have been asked to moderate this event. We've been working with many of the women involved in tonight's event for a long period of time, particularly over this campaign, to try to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. As many of you will know, there was a ceasefire in 1953, but a ceasefire, not a peace agreement. And as all of you who are involved in women, peace and security know only too well, when you do not have a peace agreement, what you have, in fact, is a frozen conflict. And a frozen conflict means that belligerents on either side remain in the mindset of war, which means, of course, a position of animosity and of distrust. And the engagement there has been over this period of time has really all been about coercion and militarized security, and made ever more dangerous by the presence of nuclear weapons. We also know that what you need to do to move from ceasefire into a peace process is you need confidence building measures. You need commitment, you need a process in order to have sustainable and transformative peace, a just peace. That needs participation and inclusion. And at present, we're not seeing anything moving from the international community to that effect. What we are seeing, though, is the actions and activities of women. And that is what we're here tonight to look at, to address, to learn more from these brilliant panelists that the campaign has brought together to explain the background, the present, and the future of how to move towards this sustainable peace. I'm sure there's not one person in this room in this virtual room, that does not want a fulsome peace agreement to bring an end to the hostility in the Korean Peninsula. And we are now looking to women to be able to give us that effect. I, of course, have forgotten one of my most important duties, and that was to instruct people that there is simultaneous translation in English and Korean. If you go on that little button on the right-hand side, which looks like the world, you can then press on whichever one it is that you need, and that will be simultaneous. And that we are going to have time for Q&A after. So for that one, don't go into the chat box, go into the Q&A so that we can actually filter them through, so we can make sure we get your questions to the appropriate person you wish to speak with. I think that was all I had to do in terms of technical support. I say I'm the least techie person here, so I'm totally dependent on all the very good backup team that has been put together to make this work. So, without further ado, let us move to the past. For that, we are very, very lucky to have Suzy Kim, who is an historian. Her real interests are in critical theory, gender studies, and oral history. So, who better to introduce what has been happening over the history of this of the lack of process towards peace? She currently teaches at Rutgers University in New Jersey. She's a founding member of Women Across the DMZ and is a career country specialist, as you would expect, for someone who has been working for this on behalf of Amnesty International. She's also on the advisory board at the Truth Foundation in South Korea, and has won awards for her everyday life in the North Korean Revolution, 1945 to 1950. I will turn the floor over to you, Suzy Kim.
Thank you, Madeleine. I was just checking the chat, and I'm hoping that people can see me, because apparently there was a comment that they couldn't see our video. If someone can make sure, if someone can just let me know that you can see me. Okay, great.
I can certainly see you, so if I can.
Okay, excellent. Yes, despite the long rehearsal and our attempts to avoid technical glitches, we seem to have had some. Okay, but fantastic. Thank you, everyone. There's a list of people joining, keep popping up, so it's really great to have everyone joining from multiple places around the world, I think. We have very short times attributed to each of us, so I'm just going to start right away with my presentation that's focused on the past. And I'm going to share my screen and hope that that works well without technical glitches. Everyone, I hope you can see my screen. So many thanks to the organizers and also to Madeleine for moderating the discussion today. I feel very honored to be part of this really amazing panel of women who will be talking about the past, present, and future of women's role in advancing peace in Korea. And of course, Madeleine is the Secretary General of WILPF, the longest women's peace the oldest women's peace organization in the world, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. But during the Cold War, alongside WILPF, there was also the Women's International Democratic Federation, which actually still exists, although they're not quite as active or high profile as they once were during the Cold War. They also campaigned for peace along with the agenda to advance women's rights throughout the Cold War. And it was formed by leftist women, anti-fascist women who were very active resisting the Nazis during World War II. They were formed shortly after the end of World War II in November of 1945 in Paris, with the participation of 850 women from 40 nations. Not a small feat at the time, so soon after the war. The Korean women actually joined in 1946 through their women's groups. And before the Korean War, women from both Koreas participated, particularly at the Second Congress of the WIDF in 1948. From the very beginning, from its inception, the WIDF campaigned against the French colonial war in Vietnam. And as a result, they were kicked out of Paris by the French government, and they had to relocate to East Berlin in 1951. And despite such challenges in that very same year, because of the ongoing Korean War that had started in 1950, they formed a fact-finding commission at the request of the North Korean women so that they could investigate war atrocities during the war. They were understandably very alarmed at the outbreak of another war just so soon after the end of World War II, just 5 years after the end of World War II. And many feared that that would essentially turn into a World War III. The commission was composed of 21 women from 17 nations, and they produced a report along with a letter addressed to the United Nations. You see a copy of the cover of the report here. And it was originally compiled in 5 languages, Korean, Chinese, English, French, and Russian. And then they were translated into many more languages after that and distributed throughout all the different women's chapters and groups that were part of the WIDF. But due to Cold War fears already permeating the world, the commission and its report was quickly declared a Soviet tool by HUAC, which is the acronym for House Un-American Activities Committee. It was a committee that was formed in the United States, in the House of Representatives, and it basically investigated what they perceived to be activities that were against the United States. And so as part of this kind of campaign, any kind of peace initiative or calls for peace across the Cold War divide were suspected of being a Soviet peace offensive. This is, I put it in quotation marks because this is the language that was used often by HUAC and in its reports. But if you look at the composition of the delegation, the women came from very diverse backgrounds, and the WIDF campaigned against nuclear testing by all parties, including the Soviet Union, once they acquired weapons. The Soviet acquired nuclear weapons in 1949. And the WIDF campaigned consistently for disarmament and the banning of all nuclear weapons and any weapons of mass destruction throughout the Cold War. Attesting to the diverse perspectives among the women, the delegation was made up of women from different parts of the world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and Europe, with different political views and religious beliefs, which led to intense debates over whether to visit the South during their trip. Despite the fact that they were invited by North Korean women, many of the women thought that they should also try to visit the South. But ultimately, the trip took much longer than the group expected, and they could not gain the approval of the United Nations side to visit the other side of this war, of this conflict. And so it ended up limiting the scope of their investigations. And as a result, the report was deemed a one-sided propaganda ploy, and some members of the delegation paid a very heavy price for their participation in this commission. For example, the West German delegate, Lily Wachter, was imprisoned by the US occupation in West Germany at the time upon her return. And there were other repercussions for some of the other members that I'll get into in a few minutes. But I should also emphasize that although I've listed the names of the countries from which the women hailed, they were not representing their governments, and they were going there in their individual capacities as peace activists. The two Korean women, the two North Korean women that were responsible for the invitation of the commission were Park Jung-hye and Ho Jung-sook. Park Jung-hye, as you see here, was the chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, and Ho Jung-sook was the Minister of Culture. I think it's safe to say that these two women were the highest ranking female members of the North Korean government at the time. And so it's not surprising that they would be the ones to invite the delegation. And they were also both very active in the activities of the WIDF, the International Women's Group. Both women were renowned socialists and feminists whose career goes back to the colonial period when Korea was occupied by Japan between 1910 and 1945. Park was a socialist labor organizer. She was known to have organized what was called red labor unions in Northern Korea at the time in the 1930s. And then when she became chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, she was chair of that organization for 20 years, from 1945 to 1965. She was also elected to the WIDF Executive Committee in 1948. And then she was also elected to the Supreme People's Assembly, the highest governing organ in North Korea. Ho was known as the Kollontai of Korea. For those of you that know anything about socialist feminist history, Alexandra Kollontai was a Russian feminist who was famous for advocating free love and free sexuality, very radical for its time. And Ho Jung-sook was a journalist by profession, and she actually studied in New York for a very short time at Columbia University in 1927. She was arrested for organizing a women's student movement in Gwangju in 1929, and then she went to China in 1936, probably escaping some of the repressive Japanese policies at the time. And she joined the Korean anti-colonial movement in China until liberation in 1945. After liberation, she was a member of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party, which is the ruling party in North Korea to this day. And then she was appointed to the cabinet as the Minister of Culture and elected to the Supreme People's Assembly. I just wanted to include a little warning here because I'll be showing a few photos now from both the report that they compiled that you saw the cover of a few minutes ago, and then also some additional footage and photos that I found in my archival research of this women's group. So the All Women Fact-Finding Commission broke up into different groups to cover as much ground as possible during their 10-day visit to document the horrors of the war with detailed recording of markings on the weapons, the numbers of the dead and the injured at each of the sites that they visited, the number of houses, farm animals, schools, hospitals, and various facilities destroyed throughout the country, especially taking note of the impact on the women and children. And here in this photo, you can see in the background just how much destruction the city sustained. I believe this is Pyongyang. Even though many of the women who were in the delegation had experienced the World War II just very recently, many of them felt that the devastation that they witnessed in North Korea was unparalleled, even next to the experiences of war that they had themselves experienced. The delegation also visited mass graves of civilian massacres that were attributed to the US forces. The most large scale of these incidences was in Sincheon and Anak that you see here. A museum that's dedicated to these victims was constructed in 1958, and it still exists to this day and is oftentimes used to educate North Korean children about the horrifying experiences of the war, which continues to be very much a lived experience to this day. The delegation heard stories of the women's losses. They shared their tears, and you see here an example of that with one of the delegation members from Cuba that you see here. Her name was Candelaria Rodriguez. You see here again in another photo, and you see her visibly shaken by what she's hearing from these women. She was another member of the delegation that suffered consequences for this trip that she took. She was jailed upon her return to Cuba and lost her job at the National Bank after her trip. And if you remember, this was 1951, so this was before Cuba, the Communist Party came to power in Cuba in 1958. And so her government basically censured her for her activities. Here you see another woman sharing tears with one of the Korean women. This is Maria Ovsyannikova from the Soviet Union, who is shedding tears with a Korean woman. And then this is here you see Monica Felton, who was from the UK, and she was also another woman who suffered consequences. She lost her job as city planner under the Labour government under the UK Labour government at the time. And she was a member of the Labour Party, but was expelled from the party for her participation in this delegation. And she was threatened with persecution or prosecution for treason. So just to say that these women, they extended their solidarity at great risk to their own lives, many of them writing wills to their families and friends in case they never returned alive. And here is the chair. She was elected chair or head of the delegation, and she was from Canada. Her name was Nora Rod, and she was a peace activist from Canada. And she was one of the few women who was able to continue to send correspondence, letters that they were exchanging with the Korean Women's Union, even after the war throughout the 1950s. And you here see the women basically gathered at the end of their fact-finding mission as they're trying to compile the report that you saw. They're having intense debates about what to include and what to leave out. And they left out anything that they felt that could not be substantiated. And you know, there were disagreements about the extent to which they should indict the United Nations, for example, and the US forces for war crimes. And I encourage you to take a look at the report. It's available online if you're interested. This is the last slide. That's the farewell ceremony where they're basically ending their trip with an exchange of gifts. You see embroideries from the North Korean women and a flag of friendship and peace from the North Korean women being exchanged. And you also see an example of a flag that was brought from Great Britain, I assume by Monica Felton that you saw, promising peace and friendship with the women of Korea. For this effort, the WIDF was stripped of its NGO consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council in 1954. They were only readmitted back in 1967, largely because the membership of the UN had changed substantially by that time to include many of the new states from the new member states from the third world. The WIDF strongly believed in the role of women to hold the UN accountable to its mandate to foster international peace. And they were very active in the UN Commission on the Status of Women from its inception in 1946. And in fact, the WIDF first proposed 1975 as International Women's Year to the 24th session of the CSW to be celebrated in conjunction with the 30-year anniversary of the founding of the WIDF. And of course, this was all well before UNSCR 1325, but this history of women's intervention during the Korean War set an important example of women's role in peace and security. And I should also just mention, as I close, that this history of women's international solidarity turned out to be a key piece in convincing the North Korean women to join the 2015 peace walk that was the start of Women Across DMZ. Thank you.
I sort of expect to hear a round of applause because that was just so amazing. And there was a point in the chat which saying just again, how amazing history. Why have we never heard of these women written out of history as always? I am going to abuse my position as moderator because that's the advantage. I'm allowed to ask a single stupid question, really, because I think there's so many of us on this call who don't know the intricacies of how the process has been halted, the process towards peace has been deliberately hindered. And that amazing story about the equivalent of commissions of inquiry, which we now have as a matter of course within the UN, that it was the women themselves who actually put that together. But my question is really this dumb one. Why were they so opposed and who were the main opponents?
Opposed to? Opposed
to their work. Why was it this collection of states persecuted the women upon their returns, who actually led to the prejudice of being in prison, losing your jobs, refusing to listen to the results of their fact-finding mission, and then refusing to act upon their recommendations?
Well, I don't think this is a dumb question at all, and I don't think any questions are actually dumb. But there's actually so much parallel to what goes on now. I think for any group or any activist that calls for peace with, for example, North Korea, peace and engagement with North Korea oftentimes are red-baited, very similar to what these women experienced in the past. Simply saying that any call for peace or engagement with the so-called enemy amounts to a kind of appeasement, or that you're legitimizing basically an evil or a failed government. And I think this idea that the world can be divided into good and evil essentially paints a very Manichaean and dark view that that some forces are meant to be simply destroyed. and that they cannot be part of this world. And it's a very dangerous view, I think. It's a view that gets in the way of any peace because it's an intolerant view. It's a view that we can't find some ways to come to a compromise or find some common ground, that we share a sense of humanity together, and that at the core of a peace process or thinking about sharing this world, we need to understand ways to work together as opposed to destroying each other. And I think, that sense of a kind of a Manichaean view was very pervasive throughout the Cold War. And so these women, for having called for peace with our so-called enemy, was condemned and persecuted for doing that.
Thank you. I think it's a really fulsome answer. And in fact, shows how far we have not moved that faith in the United Nations as being the honest broker that would actually enable and facilitate that sort of dialogue captured by the states who wish to continue with the frozen conflict. Suzy, thank you so much. There will be plenty of time, I hope, for people to come back, and I'm sure they will. Can you put in the chat box the links that you've been asked to do so that we can all read at our leisure? So moving from the history, let's look more then at the way in which diplomacy and other issues, the process towards moving towards peace can and should be furthered through diplomacy. I'm delighted to have Hyun-Sook Lee, who is the founder and honorary representative of the Women's Forum for Peace and Diplomacy. And her mission is to advance the women, peace and security agenda on the Korean Peninsula. She's chair of the National Advisory Council of Unification Education. And in 2018, she was a member of the President's Advisory Group for the Inter-Korean Summit, so has a lot of expertise and experience in having participated in some of these attempts to make peace. She's a co-founder of the Women Making Peace, which provided humanitarian assistance, and was part of the negotiation opening the Inter-Korean Women's Exchange. So there is much to be said about the numerous initiatives you've been involved with. So please share with us so we can see how the role of diplomacy has or has not made a difference. Hey there, Lee.
안녕하세요, 여러분. 반갑습니다. 특별히 오늘 이 자리를 마련해 주신 코리아 피스 나우 관계자 여러분께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다. 우리가 다 아는 대로 2020년은 안보리가 결의문 1325를 채택한 지 20주년이 되는 해고요. 그리고 한국에서는 한국 전쟁이 발발한 지 70년이 되는 해입니다. 그런 점에서 이제 오늘 이 웨비나는 큰 의미가 있다고 그렇게 생각을 합니다. 감사합니다. 이거 어떻게 넘기지? 저는 오늘 1990년대 이후에 한반도 평화를 증진시키기 위해 한국 여성들이 만들어 놓은 그 다양한 노력 가운데 분단 이후 최초라는 수식어를 낳게 했던 획기적인 활동 두 가지를 말씀드리고자 합니다. 지금 보시는 이 지도가 바로 한반도입니다. 한반도는 중국과 러시아와 일본에 둘러싸인 작은 나라인데요. 5,000년의 역사를 가진 나라이지만은 불행하게도 근대 마지막에 일본의 식민지가 되고 그 이후에 남북이 분단되는 비참한 역사를 남기고 말았습니다. 지금 보시는 대로 이 평양이 북의 이제 중심지고 서울이 남쪽의 중심지인데 불과 121마일의 거리입니다. 비행기로는 1시간 거리인데 이 거리 안에 이제 가운데 그 군사 분계선이 있어서 우리가 70여 년 동안 왕래를 못하고 오늘까지 그 전쟁 상태를 유지하고 있습니다. 세계에서 정전협정으로 이렇게 오래 전쟁 상태를 유지한 예는 아마 한반도가 유일하다고 그렇게 생각을 합니다. 한국 여성 운동에서 이제 이런 세팅에 태어난 한국 여성들은 그 한국 여성 운동에서 가장 중요한 WPS 의제, 여성 평화 안보 의제, 1325 의제라고도 하죠. 그것이 바로 한국 땅에서 전쟁 재발을 어떻게 막을 것인지, 또 분단 체제를 어떻게 해체할 것인지, 그리고 평화와 번영, 민주주의가 보장된 통일을 어떻게 성취하고, 그리고 나아가서 아시아 공동체를 어떻게 만들어낼 것인지, 이를 위해서 여성은 어떤 역할을 해야 될지 하는 것이 가장 중요한 의제입니다. 일찍부터 한국 여성들은 일제 식민지에서 시작되고 또 한국 전쟁과 세계 냉전으로 더욱 굳어진 한국 분단 체제, 그리고 역사 분쟁, 영토 분쟁이 끊이지 않는 아시아의 안보 상황, 이 두 가지 요소야말로 이 지역 여성들과 시민들의 안전한 삶을 위협하는 가장 중대한 요인이라는 인식을 가지고 이 일을 해결하기 위한 다양한 평화 활동을 펴왔습니다. 가부장제와 군사주의를 유지하고 강화시키는 분단 체제, 그리고 끊임없이 이 군사적 분쟁 요인이 되고 있는 아시아 상황, 그것을 극복하기 위한 과제가 한국 평화운동의 중심에 늘 있었습니다. 한국이 분단된 이후에 우리는 아주 오랫동안 남북 시민들은 왕래할 수 없었고요. 특히 그 이산가족까지도 자기 가족을 만나지 못한 채 세상을 떠야 하는 비인도적 상황이 지속되고 있었습니다. 그 한국에서 이산가족 상봉 신청한 인구가 13만 명이 되는데 그중에 다 돌아가시고 지금 5만여 명이 남아 계시고요. 지금까지 상봉이 국가적인 상봉이 21차례 진행됐습니다. 그 과정에서 가족을 만난 인구는 2만 명에 불과합니다. 아직도 많은 분들이 이 가족을 만나기 위해서 애타게 그 기회를 기다리고 있습니다. 1970년대와 1980년대 한국 민주화 운동에서 한국 여성들은 성장하게 됩니다. 그리고 그렇게 성장한 한국 여성들은 1990년대 세계 냉전 해체의 물결이 일자 이 기회를 주도적으로 낚아채서 일본 여성들을 매개로 이 잔인한 분단 체제에 균열을 내는 과감한 행보에 나서기 시작을 합니다. 그 첫 행보가 바로 1991년에 열린 아시아의 평화와 여성의 역할 토론의 개최입니다. 남쪽에 한국 여성단체 연합의 대표였던 이우정 교수가 1987년에 일본의 한 평화회의에 참석합니다. 그 회의에서 일본 여성 지도자들을 만나게 되는데 그 여성 지도자들을 향해서 이우정 교수님이 굉장히 대담한 부탁을 하게 됩니다. 남쪽 여성들은 북한 여성들을 40년 동안 한 번도 만난 일이 없다. 그러니 그 일본 여성들이 중재해서 외교를 벌여서 북한의 고위급 여성 지도자들을 일본에서 만날 수 있는 기회를 만들어 달라 이런 부탁을 하게 됩니다. 그래서 일본 여성들은 누구를 만나고 싶으냐 그랬더니 그 북측 최고인민위원회 부의장인 여연구 선생을 비롯한 여성 지도자들이면 좋겠다. 정말 일본 여성 지도자들은 이 제안에 사실 굉장히 당황했다고 합니다. 그러나 곧 호응하고 이 일을 위해서 이제 아주 전폭적인 활동에 나서게 됩니다. 한국 분단에 일본이 책임이 있다 이렇게 느꼈던 이 일본 여성 지도자들은 북한을 상대로 한 4년에 걸쳐서 치밀한 외교와 중재 활동을 펼칩니다. 그리고 마침내 1991년에 남한, 북한, 일본 여성들이 참여하는 아시아의 평화와 여성의 역할 토론회를 일본에서 개최하는 성과를 만들어냅니다. 분단 반세기 만에 최초로 북한의 여성 지도자들이 만나는 감격적인 일이 도쿄에서 벌어지게 됩니다. 식민지 역사와 전쟁으로 얽힌 남한, 북한, 일본 3국 간 여성 지도자들은 굳건한 여성 연대와 평화 의지로 적대적 분단 질서를 해치고 역사적 화해의 순간을 만들어냈습니다. 이렇게 시작된 아시아의 평화와 여성의 역할 토론회는 왜 저 사진이 안 나오지? 아, 있구나. 오케이. 앞으로 다시 가세요. 그 사진으로 먼저, 됐어요. 이렇게 시작된 아시아의 평화와 여성의 역할 토론회는 4차에 걸쳐서 도쿄, 일본 도쿄, 남한의 서울, 북한의 평양, 다시 도쿄에서 개최가 됩니다. 91년에서 93년에 걸쳐 진행이 됐습니다. 그리고 마침내 서울과 평양 토론회 참석을 위해서 남북의 여성들이 각각 남북 정부를 상대로 지난한 외교와 협상을 벌여야 했습니다. 그리고 남북 여성 지도자들은 분단 이후 최초로 휴전선을 넘게 군사 분계선을 넘게 됩니다. 이들은 반세기 만에 상호 적대적인 땅에 발을 들여놓음으로써 남북의 민족 화해에 신호탄을 쏘아 올렸습니다. 그리고 남북일 여성들은 4차에 걸친 토론회에서 아시아 분쟁 요소로 남아있는 일본의 전후 처리 문제와 종군 위안부 문제 해결을 공동 과제로 채택하게 됩니다. 3국의 여성들이 아시아의 분쟁 해결을 위해 공동 대응에 나선 것 또한 최초의 일이었습니다. 이 사진은 서울과 평양에서의 이제 2차, 3차 회의를 소집하기 위해서 남북 여성이 협상 테이블에 앉은 모습입니다. 바로 여기가 군사분계선에 있는 판문점이라는 곳입니다. 이 자리에서 한국 전쟁을 중단하는 정전협정이 체결된 곳입니다. 그래서 보시면은 이쪽 오른쪽에 앉으신 세 분이 남쪽 대표이고요. 이쪽 세 분이 북쪽 대표입니다. 북쪽에 가운데 앉아 계신 분이 여연구 최고인민위원회 부의장이신데 돌아가셨어요. 그리고 이제 여기에 이우정 교수, 이분이 이제 이 일을 제안했던 분인데 바로 오래전에 돌아가셨고 바로 옆이 이효재 교수님이십니다. 얼마 전에 돌아가셨어요. 그리고 이제 종군 위안부 문제를 최초로 연구하기 시작했던 윤정옥 교수님은 아직 생존 계십니다. 이 세 분 여성들이 이제 북측의 여연구 선생님을 비롯한 대표단과 협상을 벌여서 서울과 평양에서의 토론회를 성사시키게 됩니다.
In Seoul and also in Pyongyang.
그래서 이제 이것은 이 협상이 잘 돼서 그러나 대단히 지난했습니다.
The meetings went well, however, it took a long time.
토론회를 하게 됩니다.
So after that meeting, the Seoul event was held. So this picture was about that. And after that Seoul conference, the next conference was slated in Pyongyang.
있는 상황이고요. 맨 앞에 계신 분이 이우정 교수, 이효재 교수, 아까 윤정옥 선생님, 이분이 한명숙 선생님. 아이고, 앞에 가보세요. 이 한명숙 선생님인데 이 한명숙 교수 선생님은 나중에 한국의 총리가 되십니다. 여기 김윤옥 선생님도 계시네. 네, 그리고 드디어 평양에서 3차 토론회가 벌어집니다. 그리고 여기에 이분이 바로 이 아시아의 평화 여성의 역할 토론회를 성사시켰던 일본의 시미즈 스미코 전 참의원이십니다. 이분도 돌아가셨어요. 그리고 이 일을 이 선생님과 같이 손잡고 성사시킨 분이 미츠마츠코 미끼 수상 부인이십니다. 근데 지금 제가 찾을 수가 없네요. 그분도 같이 가셨고요. 네, 그래서 이제 여기에 이분들이 회의가 끝난 다음에는 김일성 주석의 초청을 받습니다. 그래서 이제 초청을 받고 대표단 3국 남북한 일본 대표단이 여기 지금 같이 기념 촬영을 했습니다. 그러나 이제 1990년대 후반에 가면은 남북 관계가 다시 경색되면서 더 이상의 이 토론회는 중단됩니다. 이제 이렇게 상황이 변하자 여성들은 아시아의 평화와 여성 역할 토론회를 조직했던 남북일에 각각 그 실행위원회가 있었는데요. 이 여성들은 이 실행위원회를 새로운 단체로 출범을 하게 됩니다. 그리고 이 아시아의 평화와 여성의 역할 토론회의 정신을 계승할 수 있는 그런 활동을 벌이게 하는데, 남쪽에서는 평화를 만드는 여성회가 만들어지고요. 북측에서는 아시아 여성과 함께하는 조선여성협회가 만들어집니다. 일본에서는 조선여성과 함께하는 일본여성회 또는 일본 부인 연락회라고도 하더군요. 그래서 각각 출범을 하고 새로운 방식의 평화운동을 모색을 하게 됩니다. 그래서 그 이후에 그 4차 회의에서 공동과제로 합의했던 일본의 전우처리 문제와 종군 위안부 문제 해결을 위해서 다양한 형태의 활동을 이어갑니다. 그걸 위해서 이제 국제회의가 여기저기서 계속 이어졌습니다. 2000년에 오면은 다행스럽게 한반도에 화해의 훈풍이 불기 시작하는데요. 역사적인 남북 정상회담이 열리고 6.15 공동선언이 채택이 돼서 바야흐로 남북 화해와 협력의 시대가 열리게 됩니다. 좀 빨리 가야 되겠네요. 그래서 이제 앞으로 좀 가시 다시. 그래서 이제 다시 이 여성들은 이 기회를 낚아챕니다. 그리고 남북 여성 양자간 협상을 주도해서 본격적으로 이제는 남북 여성 교류 시대를 열어가기 시작합니다. 바로 이제 이 사람들은 이 과정에서 북측을 상대로 아주 치밀한 협상력과 지도력을 발휘해서 분단 이후 최초로 2002년에 남북 여성 통일 대회라는 것을 개최하게 됩니다. 이게 이제 개최상 금강산에서 한 700여 명의 양쪽 여성들이 모여서 통일 대회를 하는 모습입니다. 저도 여기에 한 자리 끼어 있습니다. 네. 그다음 이제 이게 금강산에 출범식 하는 장면이고요. 이제 이런 여러 가지 행사를 했는데 분과 토론을 이제 그 분야별로 남북 여성이 분과별 토론을 벌이는 장면입니다. 1박 2일의 모임이었습니다. 정말이지 분단 이후 최초의 일이었는데요. 행사는 강연회, 분과별 모임, 또 운동회, 전시회, 관람, 공동식사, 등산 등 이렇게 서로를 배우는 시간을 가졌습니다. 우리는 이를 통해서 남북이 얼마나 다른지, 얼마나 같은지를 배웠습니다. 참가자들은 접촉을 통한 변화가 가능할지를 가능해 보기도 했죠. 6.15 공동 실현을 위해서 남북 여성이 무슨 일을 함께 할까를 의견을 나눴고요. 한반도에서 다시는 전쟁이 일어나지 않도록 평화 노력을 함께 만들어 가자는 것을 천명하기도 했습니다. 이 대회를 시작으로 남북 여성들은 평양, 서울, 그러니까 남측과 북측 양쪽 도시들을 돌면서 다양한 이름의 남북 여성 행사를 이어갑니다. 그리고 남북 여성 교류의 양과 질을 확장시키면서 신뢰를 다져가는 노력을 이어갑니다. 그렇지만 남북 관계가 요동칠 때마다 가다서다를 반복을 해야 했습니다. 이게 이제 개성에서 2015년에 모였던 모임이고요. 최근에는 2019년에 또 금강산에서도 모임을 가진 바 있습니다. 2015년에 WCD가 DMZ 평화걷기와 남북한을 방문하면서 한국 여성들은 평화를 위한 국제연대 활동도 강화하기 시작을 했습니다. 다른 한편에서는 여성과 청년들의 공공 외교 역량 강화 노력과 활동도 확대해 가고 있습니다. 또 1325 국가 행동계획 추진에도 박차를 가하고 있습니다. 이와 같이 적대적인 분단의 벽에 균열을 내고 남북 화해의 문을 열었던 1세대 여성들, 이효재, 이유정, 이효재, 윤정옥 교수 등의 도전 정신과 평화 의지는 다시 2세대, 3세대 평화운동으로 이어지고 있습니다. 최근 한국 시민사회는 한국 전쟁 발발 70년을 맞아서 코리아 피스 어필 전 세계 서명 캠페인을 시작을 했습니다. 이것은 한국 전쟁이 일어났던 3년을 기억하면서 2020년부터 2023년까지 3년에 걸쳐 걸쳐 전개되는 캠페인입니다. 세계 시민 1억 명의 힘을 모아 한반도에서 전쟁과 분단 체제를 끝내고 평화 체제를 만들어내겠다는 서명 캠페인입니다. 한반도에 새로운 평화 동력이 만들어지기 시작했습니다. 앞으로 코리아 피스 아필 서명 캠페인에도 여러분께서 많이 참여해 주실 것을 호소드리면서 오늘 저의 발제를 마치겠습니다. 특별히 이 자리를 빌어서 코리아 피스 나우 캠페인에 참여하고 연대하시는 세계 모든 여성들과 시민들께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much, Hyun-Sook. That was wonderful to show how painstakingly it's been built over all this time. It's not just a one shot, is it? It happens. And I know the amount of work it takes to bring women together. And that 2002 meeting must have been quite incredible. I'm going to waive my right to abuse my authority and ask questions because we're running 10 minutes late. So I'm going to move straight now to Christine Ahn, who I'm sure needs no introduction from me. Not if I say that congratulations on winning the 2020 US Peace Prize for your bold activism to end the Korean War, heal its wounds and promote women's roles in building peace. I think that sort of says it all, Christine, really. You've been quite amazing and indefatigable, and what in your work and passion for building peace in the Korean Peninsula. And if there is time, if there's one thing I can ask you, I would love you to talk about how it came to you that this is what you had to do, because that's one of my favorite stories ever. Anyway, Christine, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. It's such an honor to be with everybody. And thank you to everybody for joining from all around the world, including many women that crossed the DMZ with us, Brenton, Patricia, Janice, our donors who make this work even possible. I'm deeply humbled to be on a panel with such wise and brilliant women who have done so much to advance peace and improve the lives of women. Madeleine, Suzy, Hyun-Sook, and Ambassador Cho, you are truly feminists making her story. So I'm going to start my presentation here. Can you see that now? Yes, I hope. Let's see, Control F. Yeah, oh geez. Okay, here we go. Now that you've learned about the historical role women have played in advancing peace in Korea, I want to share with you about the more recent work of Women Across DMZ and our partners in the Korea Peace Now campaign. As many of you know, 5 years ago, Women Across DMZ made headlines when we brought together 30 women peace builders from around the world, including Nobel Peace Laureates Mairead Maguire and Lema Gaboe, to cross the DMZ, one of the most militarized borders in the world. Suzy Kim was on that journey, and Hyun-Sook was on the other side in Paju to greet us. We also held peace symposiums in Pyongyang and in Seoul, where we heard North and South Korean women talk about how the Korean War impacted their lives. And we walked with 10,000 women on both sides of the border. With this act, we called for a formal end to the Korean War with a peace agreement, the reunion of separated families, and women's involvement in the peace process. Since our crossing, our calls for peace have become louder and more urgent, especially after 2017, as you recall, the Fire and Fury era, when the US and North Korea came dangerously close to another war. So I want to talk to you about 5 ways that women have been laying the foundation for peace. Number 1, we've brought women together across boundaries. The initial goal of our 2015 crossing was for women from North and South Korea, kind of building on Hyun-Sook's history, and around the world, to cross the DMZ together in a symbolic act. Unfortunately, we were not able to do so, but we never stopped trying to bring women together because we are so much stronger when we are united. But in February 2016, Women Cross DMZ, we tried to bring North and South Korean women together in Indonesia. That's a handful of countries where both women can actually meet safely. We succeeded in bringing 6 North Korean women who ranged from age 20 to their 60s, many who had participated in the Pyongyang Women's Peace Symposium, and many of these women had never left North Korea before. Unfortunately, as retribution for North Korea testing a nuclear weapon just weeks before our planned meeting, South Korean President Park Geun-hye prohibited the South Korean women from meeting their North Korean counterparts. Given the intense red baiting and other repercussions for organizing the 2015 crossing, the South Korean women didn't want to face either the high fines or imprisonment. So instead, we held back-to-back meetings with both sets of women. And I really thank Suzy for making those meetings so effective. So after multiple attempts, finally, in 2018, in Beijing, we brought North and South Korean women together with women from China, Japan, Russia, the US, and Canada for the first ever Northeast Asia Women, Peace and Security Roundtable. We faced enormous challenges given the politically fraught tensions between the US, Canada, and China. That was the beginning of the Huawei crisis. But thankfully, we were able to meet in the Canadian Embassy. We talked, we laughed, we shared meals, and we discussed how we can actually achieve a more peaceful future with women at the peacemaking table. The second important thing we've done is we launched the global campaign, Korea Peace Now. In 2019, Women Cross DMZ, WILPF, the Nobel Women's Initiative, and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, which includes 4 longstanding South Korean women's peace organizations, including Hyun-Sook's and Ambassador Cho's, the Korean Women's Association United. They came together, we all came together to launch this global campaign, Korea Peace Now, Women Mobilizing to End War. And thanks to a $2 million grant from the Novo Foundation's Radical Hope Fund, we launched our campaign in 4 cities last spring, in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Ottawa, and in Seoul. Now we had the means to actually bring women from all around the globe to strategize and work together toward our shared goals of ending the war with a peace agreement, women's leadership in the peace process, and highlighting the human impacts of this unresolved conflict and the militarization of the Korean Peninsula. The third groundbreaking thing we've done is we've highlighted the impact of sanctions on North Korean people. Unfortunately, despite the US and North Korea committing to a new relationship at the 2018 Singapore summit, the Trump administration has maintained a policy of maximum pressure. That's crippling sanctions and the threat of military action to compel North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, sanctions have not succeeded in that regard, and they have severely harmed North Korean people's lives. To highlight the violence imposed by the sanctions, we commissioned that multidisciplinary panel of independent experts. They produced a groundbreaking report, The Human Cost and Gendered Impact of Sanctions. We felt it was ripe to push back against the Trump administration and the Security Council, since sanctions have been a key obstacle in advancing the peace process. So we released the report. WILPF helped us significantly. We did it at the UN in New York and in Geneva last fall. We held many closed-door meetings with the UN missions from Sweden, from Canada, from South Korea, as well as holding high-profile events at the Council on Foreign Relations and at the Korea Society. The Wall Street Journal, as you saw in the previous, they broke this story, but we also got coverage in major media, the USA Today, Forbes magazine, but it stimulated conversation where it needed to be had among the UN panel of experts. And even Special Rapporteur Thomas Quintana on North Korea human rights, he urged governments to hear our message, specifically Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Peace Now. He called for the easing of sanctions, especially during a pandemic. And most importantly, He drew the link and the importance of peace in improving human rights. What we've also done is we've engaged with senior officials from all sides. You see on the left, Matthew Pottinger, who is the senior national security advisor to the president, Deputy Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun. You see Moon Chang-in in the third picture. He is President Moon's senior advisor in North Korea, and traveled with Liz Bernstein to meet Mr. Oh Ryong-il from the National Peace Committee. And we've also been regularly in touch with the DPRK permanent mission to the UN. We believe it's important to speak to all sides and to encourage them to finally end the Korean War. Number 4, we've built a powerful national grassroots network. A key part of our work in creating the political space for peace is amplifying the calls from the grassroots. Our US National Organizing Team, led by Hyun Lee and Echo Cho, built the Korea Peace Now grassroots network. In 2 years, we've organized chapters in 10 regions across the US. Our members are multi-generational Korean Americans, peace activists, veterans, students, housewives, small business owners, academics, and others who collectively press for an end to the Korean War. They collect signatures on postcards, organize house meetings, call and meet with their representatives. They show up at town halls, they write letters to the editors, and they tell their personal stories to press their representatives. This is truly a people-powered movement led and mobilized by women. In June, we organized a National Advocacy Week with over 200 members, conducting over 90 virtual lobby visits with congressional staffers. As a result, we helped secure more members of Congress to co-sponsor House Res 6639, which bars President Trump from waging an unauthorized war against North Korea, and Senate 3395, supporting the reunion of divided Korean American families. But last and not least, we're building Korea Peace Champions. Our main legislative vehicle for building the political will for a peace agreement is House Resolution 152, which calls for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement. We've worked with Representative Ro Khanna from California to provide substantial input on this resolution. And our SPOC Washington advocacy team, led by Elizabeth Beavers and Catherine Killow, they're coordinating seamlessly with our grassroots base and team. Although it goes against over 30 years of Washington orthodoxy, we now have 51 co-sponsors, including all the contenders for the next chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Compare this to a decade ago, on the 60th year of the Korean War, when only 2 members of Congress, Dennis Kucinich and Barbara Lee, would support peace with North Korea. And shortly you will hear from some of our Korea Peace champions, including Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Jan Schakowsky, and Ilhan Omar. Although we still have a long way to go, there is growing bipartisan consensus for peace. According to a poll released last year by Data for Progress and YouGov, 67% of American voters support negotiating a peace agreement with North Korea. And surprisingly, Republicans rank the highest at 76%. We're also seeing growing support for reducing the military budget, and most Americans think that the US should negotiate with adversaries to prevent war. We're also seeing the election of younger, more diverse voices calling for a new US foreign policy away from endless wars. These are all steps in the right direction, but history tells us that there is one element that can improve the outcome of a peace process, and that is the involvement of civil society, especially women's groups. Research shows that when women are involved in peace processes, an agreement is more likely to be reached and to last. Between 1991 and 2017, women's groups were involved in 71% of informal peace processes. I think my presentation today demonstrates that our participation has helped to legitimize the formal peace process among the public. So we need women, we need members of Congress, we need the public, and we need all of you working together with us to finally bring an end to the Korean War. Our work is far from over. As someone whose family was one of countless Korean American families and Korean families on the peninsula impacted by the war. I believe that we must see an end to this conflict in our lifetimes. And with women leading the way, I believe it can be done. Thank you. So Madeleine, should I just go ahead and show the congressional video?
You can, but I just want to say that was absolutely fabulous. What a wonderful way of showing the power of women to make a change. And what a wonderful way in this week when they're having the, again, the Women, Peace and Security agenda reviewed and a new resolution coming out. And they're still talking about whether or not women should participate, really. Look what you do. Look what we do. This is how it works. And we'll ring too.
Well, we're walking in the footsteps of all the women, including the women who founded WILPF, you know, to stop World War I. And yeah, I mean,
look how scared of us they are.
So why don't you save the question just so that we can, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A about how this whole thing came about. But I want to share a video that our great Kathleen Richards compiled, which is of members of Congress. As I noted, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Ilhan Omar, Jan Schakowsky, these are all Korea Peace champions, and also a message from E.J. Jung. She is a South Korean member of the National Assembly. These are the women that are with us, that are walking this journey to end the Korean War. And so I just want to quickly share a brief video that just shows the wealth and the networks that are with us in this movement. So I'm going to quickly do this and full view. Okay, here we go.
I remember in 2015, I was in Ghana when you were in Korea. And I remember the kind of media coverage, which was terrible. I could not believe it. How the media was portraying the walk and the march and the organizing for the cause of peace. Because my own father fought in the Korean War several decades ago, and actually was, in South Korea. And it's women who are really going to make sure that we have peace in the world, because we know it's benefiting peace, threatening to those involved in conflict. We've got to continue this work. What is taking place is as a result of your bravery and your work. And you're really a true testament to what power can do if women organize. I remember being alone in 2001 when I voted against the authorization to use force. And I knew then that was the right vote. But my gosh, the kind of criticism and harassment and death threats I got were horrible. We have to keep fighting and being on the right side of history, regardless of the criticism and regardless of who attacks us, because we see now, for me, years later, there are those who really now understand what I meant in 2001. There are many, many who understand now what you have done and what you have meant to the cause of peace and unification on the Korean Peninsula. And so I just want to celebrate your courage and just say thank you.
As we all know, around the world, women are disproportionately affected by war and conflict and violence. And at the same time, women are acting as some of the best and most effective advocates for peace. We have seen success stories in Syria and Yemen where women, peace activists, came together to facilitate negotiations and actually achieve ceasefires. Women around the world are actively working to advance peace talks and to ensure a successful transition from conflict to peace. It is our job as members of our nation's legislatures to support these incredible, courageous women. That during the next administration, the new president will have a responsibility to make progress with North Korea and to find diplomatic solutions. As a member of Congress, I look forward to supporting those efforts. And I will continue pushing for a formal end to the Korean War. I will also continue working to ensure that the negotiation table always includes women, and that women's voices are not only heard, but are put into action. I truly believe that without women meaningfully involved in the process of making peace, that we can achieve a lasting and durable peace on the Korean Peninsula. And I look forward to continuing to work alongside of you to achieve this goal.
I believe Congress needs to have a tighter oversight over sanction power. And we need to put a much more thought into the humanitarian human rights and geographical impacts of our sanctions regime. Too often, especially with long-standing rivals like North Korea, we put new sanctions in place out of pure muscle memory. But as you know, it's not just not working in North Korea. It hasn't worked in Iran, it hasn't worked in Cuba. So it's really important for us to think about what a new approach would look like. And we need it to be a much more informed and thought through process where we examine the impact these kind of sanctions are going to have in different countries, especially in North Korea. I fully support high-level diplomacy with North Korea, not only as means for denuclearization of the peninsula, but also as means of finding a path to a lasting, sustainable peace in Korea. I, like many people, don't trust Donald Trump will be able to solve this, but we shouldn't turn our back on high-level diplomacy as a concept just to distance ourselves from him. I was one of the original co-sponsors of HR 152, the House resolution calling for a formal end to the North Korean War, because I strongly believe that there can be no sustainable peaceful solution on the peninsula until the Korean War has been brought to a formal end. The United States should seize this opportunity to lead the global response and reinvest in diplomacy, including with North Korea.
안녕하세요. 대한민국 국회의원 집권여당 더불어민주당 이재정입니다. 위민크로스 DMZ 그 5년의 역사가 이뤄낸 것들 너무나 자랑스럽고 위대합니다. 대한민국 국회의원으로서 4년간 의정활동하면서 가장 인상적이고 스스로 자랑스러운 일이 바로 위민크로스 DMZ 여러분과 함께 워싱턴을 방문해서 한반도 평화, 세계 평화를 위해서 한 걸음 다가섰던 기억입니다. 국회라는 공간이 남성 위주의 또 경직된 대한민국의 오래된 문화 안에서 할 수 있는 일들이 많지 않았었습니다. 하지만 가능성, 여성들의 가능성을 배울 수 있었던 계기입니다. 이제 재선 의원이 되었습니다. 다시 선출된 국민대표 이재정은 이제 한반도 평화를 위해 적극적으로 나서겠다고 다짐하고 있습니다. 여러분들의 5년의 성과, 그 이상의 남은 우리들의 과제를 위해서 이재정이 함께하겠습니다. 함께 손맞잡고 여러분과 묵묵히 걸어가겠습니다.
And there you have it. Back to you, Madeleine.
No, we totally have it. What a great bunch of political allies you've got together. How refreshing to hear that from the American Congress. So she is the outsider, but yes, that gives you hope. I'm going to move us ahead because again, we are short on time. We may be able to push it till 9 o'clock, but I really want to give enough time so we can hear from Youngsook. She's the ambassador for gender equality and a real one, because we do have some who are political appointees. But she's a feminist movement activist with a lot of experience working from the student movement right the way through now to the Women's Workers Association, of which she's a founding member. She's tried to change the unequal gender power structure and social norms that undermine the realization of women's human rights and gender justice in the progress of democratization and peace building in the Korean Peninsula, which is so fundamentally important. And those issues of gender power structures and norms are very close to the work that WILPF does. So really looking forward to hearing from you and your intervention. Thank you very much.
네, 반갑습니다. 앞에 저희가 오랜 역사
속에서 여성평화 운동이 어떻게 전개되었고 한반도에서 이러한 그 여성평화 운동이 어떻게 또 불기차게 진행되어 왔는가 얘기를 잘 들었습니다. 저는 그런 역사적 그 과정과 배경하에서 지금의 한반도를 뿐만 아니라 전 세계적으로 장기화되고 있는 코로나 위기 그리고 여성 평화 안보를 둘러싼 분쟁의 위기가 동시적으로 여성들에게 어떻게 영향을 미치고 있고 그런 상황에서 우리가 어떻게 문제를 해결해 나가야 될 것인가에 관해서 여러분들하고 같이 앞으로 무엇을 하면 좋겠는가라는 제안을 좀 드리고자 싶습니다. 현재 전 세계가
explore some of the solutions.
전통적인 그
Currently,
분쟁과
throughout the
갈등 및
world,
자연
we not only
재해로
have
인한 인도주의
conventional
위기
threats and
그리고 덧붙여서
disputes
코로나19
and
장기화에 따른
natural
심각한
disasters
위기를 겪고
affecting
있습니다.
us. So we,
한국과
on
같이
top of that,
경제적으로
have
발달한
protracted
사회에서조차도
COVID-19 affecting us
다수가
all.
일자리를 잃는 등 경제, 사회적
Korea,
위기
which is
그리고
relatively
그에
well
따른
off, is also
갈등을
affected
경험하고
by
있습니다.
COVID-19, and many are
이
losing their
과정에서
jobs,
여성의
and
위기가
many are
크게 계류하고
experiencing social and
있는데요.
economic
코로나19 의료
crisis. And I
현장에서
believe that
직접
women
환자를
are being
돌보는 의료인의
affected
70%
as
이상이
well
여성이고
in Korea.
이는
More than
코로나19가
70%
발생하기
of
이전부터
health
이미 여성들이
care
돌봄 노동의
providers in
70%
Korea
이상을
are
차지하고
women, and this
담당하고
shows
있었다는
that
것을
more than
말해주는
70%
것입니다.
of care
전
work
세계
were
어디에서나 마찬가지로
disproportionately falling
여성들은
on
사회가
women's
요구하는
shoulders. So
필수적인
whichever
노동을
country
돌봄 노동을
that you
제공하면서
look at,
사회
I believe
경제를
that women have been
지탱해 오고
providing this
있습니다.
essential care
그러나
work that
코로나19가
society
전개되면서
requires,
공적 사회
and have been
사적
also
영역을
engaging in various
막론하고
socio-economic
여성들이 여전히
activities.
폭력,
But with the
차별의
protracted
1차적인
COVID-19
피해 대상이 되고 있습니다.
pandemic, I believe that regardless of formal and
구테레스 위안
informal economic
사무총장이
fields,
women
women are
사람을
falling
차별하지
victims
않지만
to violence
영향과
and discrimination.
파급효과는 남녀에
UN
따라
Secretary General
각각
Guterres
다르게
mentioned that
미친다.
the virus does
따라서
not
코로나19
discriminate,
회복
but its
노력의
impacts
중심에
do.
여성과 소녀를
Therefore, he
세워야
urged
한다고 강조한 바
countries to
있습니다.
put women and girls at
이는
the center
우리와
of all
같이
efforts to
페미니스트 여성
tackle and recover from the
활동가들이
COVID-19
오랫동안
pandemic.
국제사회에
This
제기해온
is the very
진단한
message that
점이었습니다.
we, the women peace
코로나19
activists,
상황에
have been
대처하기 위한 정책의 중심에
setting,
여성을 세우는 나라는 많지
and also
않습니다. 코로나19로 인해 여성이 공적 그리고 사적 영역에서 전담해온 돌봄 노동의 중요성이 부각되었음에도 불구하고 코로나19 이후에 사회 경제적 파장은 여성에게 더 악영향을 미치고 있는 현실입니다. 여성은 여전히 평화롭지 못한 삶을 살고 있습니다. 국제사회는 현재 코로나19를 비롯한 장기화된 위기와 전통적인 무력 분쟁, 재난으로 인한 갈등 상황을 동시에 겪고 있는데요. 이런 상황에서 우리 앞에는 성평등이 더욱 가속화될 가능성과 더 악화될 가능성이 놓여 있습니다. 지금과 같이 여성에 대한 돌봄 노동의 일방적 전가와 성폭력 가해자에 대한 처벌의 관용 등 젠더 기반 차별을 심화시키도록 방치한다면 당연히 성불평등이 더욱 심화될 것이 분명합니다. 코로나19는 여성이 더 부담을 안고 살아가는 과거로부터 성불평등한 오늘의 현실을 전 세계가 자각하는 기회가 되고 있습니다. 따라서 코로나19를 계기로 드러난 글로벌 돌봄 위기를 계기로 성평등이 기반이 된 포용적인 여성평화 안보 프로세스를 만들기 위한 논의를 진행해야 된다고 봅니다. 위기 극복을 위해서는 여성 참여와 리더십 발휘가 중요합니다. 따라서 여성평화 안보 프로세스를 강화시킴으로써 여성의 경험, 관점, 이해가 반영되도록 재구조화하고 기존의 성불평등이 재생산되는 것이 아닌 성평등을 가속화시키는 방향으로 추진되어야 합니다. 그런 점에서 저는 전 세계 여성들에게 역사가 장기화된 위기의 역사였고 차별과 폭력의 역사였다는 점에서 위기를 기회로 만들어낸 것 또한 여성들이었다는 점을 강조하고 싶습니다. 코로나19로 인해 확인된 최근의 위기가 지난 몇 년 전부터 국제사회가 주목해온 장기화된 재난위기에 대한 대응 전략으로서의 인도주의, 개발, 평화 넥서스를 모색하는 흐름 속에서 해결책을 찾는 것이 필요해 보입니다. 인도주의와 개발 그리고 평화를 통합 연계하려는 국제사회의 최근 흐름은 여성평화 안보를 주관하는 국가들에게 여성평화 지속가능 발전의 넥서스를 모색하기에 좋은 환경을 제공해주고 있기 때문입니다. 분쟁 이전과 분쟁 과정, 분쟁 이후의 전 과정에 여성이 평화 유지자, 평화 중재자, 평화 건설의 지도자로 참여할 수 있도록 보장하면서 여성평화 안보 프로세스의 전 과정에 의미 있는 참여를 할 수 있도록 보장하는 여성평화 안보 거버넌스의 구축은 장기화되고 있는 코로나19 위기에 더욱 심각해진 인도주의 위기, 지속가능 발전의 위기, 그리고 여성평화 안보가 동시에 위협을 받는 상황에서 더욱 절실하다고 봅니다. 2020년 현재 전 세계 84개국에서 유엔 안보리 132와 결의안의 국내 이행을 위한 국가 행동계획이 이행되고 있습니다. NAP는 인도주의와 지속가능 발전 그리고 평화의 연계를 통해서 여성평화 안보를 국내외 차원의 이행을 동시에 추구할 수 있는 도구입니다. 그러나 NAP의 이행 과정에 대한 실질적인 모니터링과 평가를 민간 여성 단체들이 수행하도록 참여를 보장하고 민간 여성 단체들이 여성평화 안보의 리더십을 키울 수 있도록 재정을 지원하는 국가는 많지 않습니다. 좋게는 동북아 지역 나아가 아시아 그리고 궁극적으로는 글로벌 차원의 여성평화 안보 국가행동계획 민간 여성단체 네트워크를 통해서 국내적, 국제적 차원의 일관된 통합과 평화를 위한 지식 역량의 향상을 위한 공동의 교육훈련 프로그램을 실시하도록 지원하는 노력이 필요합니다. 국제사회가 함께 협력해서 공동의 교육훈련 프로그램을 만들기 위해서는 한국과 같은 ODA 공여국 국가의 역할이 중요하다고 여겨집니다. 대한민국의 양성평등 대사로서 저는 이러한 여성평화 안보 프로세스에 민간 여성 단체들의 참여가 활발화될 수 있도록 여러 가지 국제적인 그리고 국내적인 지원 활동을 적극적으로 나서도록 여러분께 약속드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.
There's so much to say on that, and thank you so much for bringing out the whole pandemic elements and also the linkages to the whole women, peace and security agenda, which is so difficult to actually have the implementation that we need. And I think we all know what needs to be done, it's just not happening. And I think it goes back to the beginning of the debate when we had those amazing women doing that incredible work in fact-finding missions, but blocked. Why are we getting constantly blocked? Where are the obstructions coming from? Which is why I think it's so important. The work that's going on now is to find those fissures to go through and to build that structure, which is strong enough for us to be able to build an effective and sustainable peace. We are now dangerously close to being well over time. I'm looking for any questions in the Q&A, but I'm not seeing any at the moment. So maybe we could just go back to Christine, because I would love you, I think it'd be very fitting, Christine, if you just told your little story, the big story, which gave birth to all of this, so that would be just a wonderful uplifting way for us to close, I think.
Well, it's really came from a dream that I had, and it was in 2000, gosh, I think it was in 2009. I woke up in the middle of the night and I turned on the computer and saw on the homepage of the New York Times an article about the flooding of the Imjin River, which is a river that flows through the heart of the Korean Peninsula. And North Korea allegedly lifted the floodgates to prevent flooding of the farms in the north. And in that process, several South Koreans died, including a father and his son, in the early morning when they were fishing. And I at the time it was Kim Jong-il and in the north, and Lee Myung-bak, who was the former CEO of Hyundai, as president in the South. And I just remember feeling despair and frustration. The hotline had been shut off between the two Koreas. There was no progress. A conservative government was in power in South Korea, reversed all the extraordinary work that Hyun-Sook and other civil society activists and reunification movement in South Korea had waged for a decade under the Sunshine Era. And I just remember being pissed, basically, like, why are these two men not even talking and resolving this, and people are still dying as a result of this unresolved war? And that's when I went back to sleep, and I had this dream where I was wading literally in the river, and I was wondering if people were going to come. And it was right before the crack of dawn, and a light started to flow down the river, and that light eventually morphed into families, elderly Koreans who have not seen their families in the north, embracing each other. It was very emotional, and I was witnessing it in my dream, but I wanted to know where the light was coming from. So I continued to tread up the river, and that's when I came to the source of the light, which was a circle of women. And they were stirring something that was like a big black pot, like witches, and whatever they were stirring, they poured into vessels that then flowed down the river to become this light. And I woke up and I told my then husband, I know who will end the war, the Korean War. It will be women. Women will end the Korean War. And then I woke up the next day to say, well, how are we going to do this? And I said, I really need to know the history of women doing this. And I got a fellowship at the University of Michigan, and I began to, with my co-conspirator, Hae-jung Park, to start interviewing through the oral histories of South Korean women, of how they were able to do this. And in Hyun-Sook's presentation, I learned that Japanese woman, Shizumi, from the parliament, was able to help facilitate the meeting of the North and South Korean women. And so that's when I realized that we, especially in the United States, that divided the Korean Peninsula, that waged this indiscriminate bombing campaign that destroyed 80% of North Korean cities, we have a responsibility to play. And so that's when many of us, many women who are on this call, joined in together to organize that historic crossing of women to end the Korean War.
I think that is one of the most powerful images I've ever heard as kickstarting or continuing a movement for change. And the imagery of the river and everything is just fabulous. There's also a lovely quote from Doris Lessing, which I love, which is, if you can imagine something strongly enough, there will come a time when you will achieve it. And that is just testimony to this, I think. There is one question which may bring us down a little bit after that sort of wonderful imaginative story. We have from Anne Wright, does anyone want to make any comments on upcoming US election, Biden's thug remarks and Trump's stalemate in love letters?
I can respond to that. I'd love to hear from the others. I mean, I just think that it's a false dichotomy. I think that the way that the debate was framed was that you either don't engage or you don't meet, or you know, I mean, you know, I think the Democrats have gotten it all wrong. I mean, it's good to meet with our adversaries. How do you end a 70-year war without meeting and having dialogue? And the unfortunate thing was, it was a good thing that President Trump did meet with Kim Jong-un. It was good that they had summits. The bad thing is that the US was not willing to change its US policy of maximum pressure. And so meeting is one thing, but if you don't have a fundamental shift in US policy towards North Korea, then you're not going to achieve anything. And so that's where we're stuck. And that's why we really do need to be putting pressure and mobilizing people, putting pressure and you know, working with women members of Congress and other progressive peace champions, because the state of propaganda in this country, in the United States, against North Korea is so deep and so entrenched that it's going to take all of us to transform that narrative and believe that we can get to a peace agreement to formally end the war.
Great answer. I think actually looking at what when you reference the opinion polls, it looks as if there is a willingness amongst the great US population to do just that. So Congress should actually do what people want. Such will be the meaning of democracy, it is suggested. Would anybody else like to comment on that?
Or maybe any closing remarks from Hyun-Sook or Youngsook.
Please.
Ambassador Cho.
Everyone's being shy. After all that brilliant work, no one wants to say
네.
a final comment. Ambassador Cho.
네, 제가 너무 발제 시간을 많이 잡아서 저는 이번에는 안 하도록 하겠습니다.
아, 네. 저는 그 Women Cross DMZ 활동이 국내에 미친 영향력이라고 하는 것들이 앞으로 어떻게 더 지속될 수 있을까? 그리고 어떻게 더 발전될 수 있을까? 그리고 지금의 한반도 상황을 넘어서서 어떻게 이 글로벌 전체의 여성 평화 안보를 끌어나가는 여성 평화 운동의 이니셔티브를 어떻게 가져갈 수 있을까에 대한 고민을 앞으로 좀 더 많이 하면 좋겠다. 그리고 이런 기회들을 통해서 많은 분들하고의 네트워크가 이루어지면 좋겠는데 가장 바라건대는 가까운 시일 내에 남북 여성들이 다시 만날 수 있는 기회들이 이루어질 수 있기를 기대합니다. 네, 감사합니다. 오늘 좋은 기회였습니다.
Solidarity and movement building, love it, yes. We have 6 minutes left. There were 2 questions. One, and can you be very, very quickly, someone would just say who is going to respond to it. How can the Korea Peace Now campaign help to reduce overall demonization of North Korea? I think sort of you've answered that one because it's what you're doing.
It's what we're doing. And I think we just need to do more of what we're doing. And I think that's why it's so critical that we have, that this campaign continues to stay afloat. And sadly, you know, that requires money, that requires investment. And, you know, we are facing an economic contraction, and who's going to get hit? But the women peace activists, you know, the women's peace movements. And so I do think that, you know, Canada has been a supporter of some of this work. And I'm hoping that other countries will also step in, especially those with feminist foreign policies that see the extraordinary work that is being done by ordinary women on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to leave it to that, but I would love, I think there was a question from Hyun that would be great to hear from the South Korean women.
Who's going to jump in?
Hyun-Sook or Ambassador Cho, the question was, in order to declare the end of the war, what diplomatic attempts are needed to bring the US, China, and other parties back to the negotiation table? And what plans are underway to make an end of war declaration possible? I mean, we'd love to hear, especially since President Moon has been really leading a lot of those initiatives.
And you've got to say all that in less than 4 minutes.
선생님이 좀 하세요. 내가 질문을 잘 못 들어. 제가 질문을 조금 한 번 더 말씀해 주시겠어요?
I think the question is what do we see possible as an end of war declaration, and what is needed to bring back the US, China, and North and South Korea together to bring an end to this war?
지금 국제 정치로서는 지난 70년 동안 아무것도 지금 해결을 못 했거든요. 그래서 이제는 시민의 힘으로 이 전쟁 상태를 끝낼 수밖에 없다는 그런 합의에 이르렀습니다. 그러니까 국제 정치에서는 지금까지 어떤 실마리를 찾기가 어려웠고 여러 번 많은 시도들이 있었습니다. 전쟁을 끝내고자 하는 여러 시도들이 있었는데 결국 실패하고 70년을 맞았기 때문에 이제는 시민 외교로서 해결할 수밖에 없다. 그래서 3년 안에 1억 명을 모아서 1억 명의 서명을 받아서 UN 안보리에 세계 시민의 평화 의지, 종전 의지를 전달하고 그걸 위해서 이제 저희가 가장 중요한 관련 국가들을 위해서 로비나 외교에 나설 것입니다. 근데 현재는 초기라서 우리의 이 평화 코리아 피스 어필을 알리는 일의 1단계로 지금 힘을 모으고 있고요. 그 다음 단계로 가면 각국 정부를 향해서 관련 정부를 향해서 저희가 적극적인 민간 외교에 나설 그런 생각을 갖고 있습니다.
Excellent, thank you. That's a lovely way to actually address the issues. It's about citizens working together. This is what we're saying. It's solidarity. Christine, you have a question.
Well, I do, and I'm not sure if he's still on, but we have Ambassador Jakob Hallgren, the Swedish ambassador to South Korea, to the Korean Peninsula. And I would love to ask him, given Sweden's role as the liaison between the US and the DPRK, if he has any insights, and especially coming from Sweden, which pioneered feminist foreign policy, the role that he sees Sweden playing moving forward. I don't know if he's still on, but
Hello.
yes, hi.
Sorry, hi, my name is Victoria. I'm the head of the political section at the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul. Unfortunately, Ambassador Hallgren is not with us right now. He had another commitment starting at 10 a.m. So he's no longer joining you.
Okay, do you have anything you want to share, Victoria, or?
I mean, I just really want to congratulate, what you're doing, and I think that it's definitely a role to play for. I heard you were mentioning before that the countries with the feminist foreign policies, of course, we might have, already that kind of mindset on, and I hope, that there will be a role also, where Sweden can try to work on these more women encounters. But as you might know, also now in DPRK at the moment, the Swedish embassy remains open. However, due to COVID-19, our diplomats are no longer in Pyongyang. They are now based in Stockholm until it's possible to come back. But communications channels and through the embassy in Stockholm is still going. So, we are keeping the contacts with the North Korean authorities.
Great, thank you, Victoria. Okay, Madeleine, I'll leave it to you to close up.
Well, thank you everyone for this. Has been, I think, a really rich and important discussion, and I have learned a tremendous amount, and it just shows a continuum of women's activism from before the war right the way through to where we are now. And hugely significant, I think, is this call, this constant call that it's going to have to be we the people who are going to deliver peace on the Korean Peninsula. And there's a lovely film made about the Irish women who brought peace to Northern Ireland. And the title of that film is Waving Goodbye to Dinosaurs, because it's how they saw off those entrenched positions brought from conflict, which has gone on for so long that people really feel incapable of moving out because of pride, because of a feeling of surrender if they do actually cross the line to talk to those who are on the opposite side. And this is where we are, and this is what we must do. So let's together wave goodbye to those dinosaurs who refuse to bring peace. Thank you all so much, and let's do this.